Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello, I'm Zina Shevchik. Welcome to Parenting in the 21st Century. Today we have with us Mary Fellows, Manager of Family and Youth Services from Upper Hudson Library System. She's going to discuss with us a recent report by the National Endowment for the Humanities, which reports a general decline in reading among teenage Americans. Thank you for being here today,
Sure.
Mary. Would you tell us something about the report?
Sure. The National Endowment for the Arts did a report on reading, which they released last November. And it looked at the findings from 40 other studies and consolidated those in the report that NEA released. And what the report found was that Americans are reading less and Americans are reading less well. This was particularly evident when we look at teenage Americans. There is a real deterioration of reading skills between teenagers now and teenagers of, say, 10 years ago. This is particularly evident in kids who are not reading quite as well as their peers.
And why do you think this is important?
I think it's a cause for concern in three different areas. One is economic, one is social, and one is civic. The economic reasons, American teenagers read less well than teenagers in 15 other developed countries. And if we extrapolate that out to when these kids go to college and enter the business world, and these are going to be the business leaders of America, that lessens our competitive edge in the global economy. So it puts us at a disadvantage economically. Also on a personal level, employers look at how well their employees or their applicants can read. If you're an applicant for a job and you're reading the application and there are parts of it that you don't understand and you fill them out wrong, or an employer gives you a test and you misread it or you don't understand it and you don't do well on it, you're not going to get that job. If you have a job and you have to read something like a report for your work that's very instrumental in your job, and you're not understanding it because you're not a very good reader, that's going to impact how you do your job, and it's going to impact whether you are considered for a promotion, whether you're considered for a raise. All of those kinds of things can affect your future economically, so they're really very direct effects. Socially, readers have been found, and this is a very interesting statistic, I thought, people who read exercise more. Now, who would have thought? But they found in this study that readers exercise more, they play more organized sports, they go to the theater, they go to other kinds of cultural events. So they become really better rounded, more interesting people if they read. You know, they have more social success in life because they're able to do all of these different things. And then the third area is a civic impact. People who read vote, and people who read volunteer in their communities. Well, we know that voting is both the right and responsibility of all of us in a democracy. And if you look at your community and you think about all of the organizations that benefit from having volunteers, from your child's preschool to a religious organization that you're part of, to all kinds of things, if we didn't have those volunteers, we would all have much poorer quality of life. So from a social and civic standpoint, just our culture, we really need volunteers. From a personal standpoint, if you volunteer, you gain a perspective, you meet new people, you might get new job opportunities. There's a sense of being connected to this issue as well as to other people in your community. So there's some real personal benefits to volunteering that come as well. So if you're not a reader and you're not out in the community volunteering, the community is poorer and you are poorer.
What do you think, or did the study talk about solutions or causes? Were there connections between maybe two income, two career families, single parent families? Were there connections to socioeconomic patterns and anything like that?
It really didn't go into those kinds of details so much because it was surveying all of these other 40 studies. A couple of things it did find is that adult Americans are reading less well no matter what their education level. So even if you're a highly educated person, your reading skills are still deteriorating from where they were maybe 10 years ago. Another thing that it found, which I thought is really important for us to remember, is that there is a gender gap. And in teenage boys and teenage girls, when we look at both of them at a 12th grade level, there is a real gap between where a girl reads and where a boy reads, and we need to address that.
I get from my own reading in the past, I think that the professionals have known that there is less willingness by boys or less ability by boys when they're young to be attracted to reading. So you're saying that the studies highlighted this point, or they're finding an even greater gap?
Well, both. It highlights it and it shows that as kids become teenagers, that gap grows.
Now, I want you to talk a little bit about what you do at your work, at your job, your title, so that we can connect why I'm asking you solutions before we go to that. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm manager of youth and family services at Upper Hudson Library System. And Upper Hudson is one of 23 public library systems in New York State. We don't serve the public. We serve the public libraries. So your average person doesn't know what Upper Hudson is. You can't come to Upper Hudson and borrow materials, but we're the behind-the-scenes force in a lot of what you're doing at your local libraries. When you're using the catalog to check out, what materials are there, or you're doing it at home, from home at midnight, you're putting a hold on a book and asking it to be sent to your library. That's part of what Upper Hudson does. So we provide services to the public libraries to facilitate public libraries providing services to the public. We make it easier for the libraries. So what I do is that I work with the librarians who serve kids and teens and families in all of our 29 libraries. And so one of my roles is to write grants, to coordinate training, to be on top of what's going on in the field so that we can help our libraries serve teenage boys better, help teens keep reading through those years when there seems to be a disconnect between reading and whatever else they're doing.
And so have you, before this report even came out, were you working toward more programs for boys or younger boys and all teenagers, or do you think that there's going to be more funding toward those kinds of programs in the future?
I do think that there is definitely more of an awareness, particularly about boys and reading, than there was, say, a year ago. There have been some books, there have been some studies, there are some national speakers who are really making a crusade of pointing out the need for boys to read and the fact that there's a real disconnect from boys as younger children to boys as teenagers. So there's a lot more information out there, and libraries are working very, very hard to try to help parents address that, to also bring boys into the library and develop that relationship so that there's some continuity with boys, not only with the library, but with reading through those teenage years.
Have you in your work ever noticed a difference between the number of the difference in gender of parents who are bringing their boys or girls to libraries or to library programs? Have you noticed anything like that, or is it just that later on the boys tend to stop using libraries or reading books?
It does tend to be more mothers who bring boys to the library. I think, and of course I'm generalizing, but mothers are doing some more of the errands in the family, and the library is one stop on that, which is great. We want the library to be an important stop for a family each week. What we need to see more of is we need to see more fathers, and we need to see fathers modeling reading for their sons. One of the speakers talks about how when he went away to college and came home, all of a sudden his father wanted to talk with him about the books he'd read, and he didn't even realize that his father was a reader because his father did all his reading in the bathroom. So we need to bring reading out of the bathroom, and we need to have sons seeing their fathers read.
More than the sports pages.
Exactly.
And what do you think the libraries can do about that? I mean, I have some ideas as a librarian myself, what might attract a man, but are there more father programs, father and child programs being offered, for example?
Libraries are trying some of that. We certainly have mother-daughter book groups, and there's some father-son things happening as well. Part of what we offer is simply knowledge to parents about how they can encourage this. One of the things that we say to parents is you need to model it. You need to be reading in your home. You need to let your child see that you're reading, and you need to be enjoying your reading. So you choose things that you like to read. And if it's a magazine, great. If it's a nonfiction book, fine. Whatever it is, just read and let your child see you reading. Another important part, I think, is to talk with your teenager about reading. You know, make it a topic of conversation at the dinner table. Well, what have you been reading? Well, this is what I've been reading. And share the fact that you enjoy reading, or that you read, the way that you read helps you in your job. You know, we're trying to make those direct connections for kids and teens of reading and a personal benefit. So the personal benefit is maybe I was having a really rough day and I picked up this novel that I've been reading, and I felt so much better after 15 minutes of reading because it was like a mini mind vacation. Well, they can relate to that. Or I was struggling at work and I had this thing I had to read, and after I read it, I really understood more what I was supposed to do. It's a benefit. And so they can see that if their parent is showing it to them.
Right. When my children were young, what I remember hearing public service announcements or at the library was to always have a lot of different kinds of reading material around the house. And I think that in my opinion, that's one of the easiest ways that parents can influence their children. If just having a few subscriptions of magazines, different kinds of magazines, at least one newspaper in the house, and to have different kinds of other materials. Even having a crossword puzzle is something that I found when I did it. My kids asked me what it was, and they tried to help me along with it. Or board games, more and more. You can find board games that require some reading and require some critical thinking that can be helpful. So I assume that's part of the suggestions from government and public libraries as to what to do for your children.
Sure, we want to make it easy. We want to make it easy and make it fun. So your idea of having a variety of materials is great. Making the library a regular stop for the whole family, and come together on a regular basis, set a few guidelines about the fact that your kids have to check out some books. Libraries have lots of great things. We have movies, we have music, we have video games, we have all kinds of wonderful things. And those are great. And in this segment, we're talking about reading. So we want to make sure that they're also reading.
Right. Do you think that, or does the study address the issues of the proliferation of online information and TV watching? Is there any correlation made in the studies? Well, you said that this main study reviewed several, what did you say, 40? 20,
right.
40 other studies. So I'm supposing, since I haven't read the study myself, that some of those sub-studies must have addressed at least a little bit the access to other activities on the computer and TV as an obstacle, perhaps, to reading.
There's certainly a lot more competition than there ever was. The study did find that among young adults ages 15 to 24, so we're talking high school students and college students and a little bit on either end, that they spend nearly 2 hours a day watching television as compared to 7 minutes reading. So clearly, media is something that takes their time that they might be spending reading.
Right. So I do think that the connection of reading to the well-being of a person individually, socially, civically, economically, in terms of being able to get a job, keep a job, get the job they want, as well as to the culture as a whole, is very important, because I would assume that as libraries, as social institutions, have a goal to educate parents as to the benefits of them to them individually, their kids, is very important. So I would assume that we're going to start seeing more and more public service and public institution programs about family activities involving reading, because I think that you're right, that, and the study is right about fathers, because mothers do go to libraries with their kids, particularly when they're young, and that's a standard activity. But to have the dad come at night for evening programs or on weekends is not something that's I think out there in the general public's idea of what a family does together. So that's something that the institutions can certainly reach toward. It's difficult, I think, like my daughters who are in college, they say that they study all the time. And contrary to what a lot of people think, most of their studying is being done from books. Granted that some of their work is online. They're much more so than when either you or I were in college, but even online requires reading and critical thinking. And maybe someday everything that's on TV and on the computer will be in a non-reading format, God forbid. But right now, reading is still very essential. Even to text messaging, my kids text message each other all the time, and the idea that they do a simple spelling is that's a form of reading and writing, even though it's a code. Sure. And so you still have to put words together in a certain pattern for another person to understand. And email, I mean, it's the same thing. It's, even though we're moving into this extraordinary technological age, it's still reading based. Sure. And I think parents don't understand generally how critical it is still to keep the reading as a pattern of behavior in school, at home. Right. Because everything else is interfering, even sports, outside curricular activities, there's the push. Sure, there's a lot of competition. One of the things we also need to think about is redefining reading. I think sometimes we talk about reading and people think reading means reading a novel, reading some fiction or some heavy book, and that's not necessarily it. Certainly reading can encompass that, but there are so many different ways to read. One of our other strategies that we suggest to parents is to give books as gifts. But if you have a teenage boy who professes to hate reading, don't give him a novel. Give him a graphic novel. I was just thinking about that. Sure. Maybe you could tell us what that is, what the benefits of using or reading a graphic novel. A graphic novel is a fairly new term for what is essentially a long comic book that has a beginning and a middle and an end. In that, comic books were often kind of serial stories, they continued on. A graphic novel is a book in and of itself, but the format is much like a comic book in that there are frames and there are pictures and there's text usually in the bubbles or beyond it. And so it's a much more visual experience for the reader.
but they're reading. They're reading that text, as well as one can argue that they're reading the pictures. That's another form of literacy, is the visual literacy. But for a teenage boy who really doesn't enjoy the print experience and maybe has had a hard time with it, this is an avenue to get them back into enjoying at least a little bit of print literacy through the avenue of a graphic novel. And there are all kinds of graphic novels out there. It's really burgeoned in the last few years.
I would like you to talk a little bit more about that, about what kinds of subjects are in the graphic novels, if you don't mind, because I'm not that familiar with the format, and so I think our audience probably would like to learn about it as well.
Sure. It really started with graphic novels that were for a more mature audience. For example, Art Spiegelman did a graphic novel called Mouse, and it was about Nazi Germany. And so definitely for a more mature audience. There's another one called Blankets that deals with some family relationship issues of a teenage boy, a little more on the mature side. But as graphic novels grew in popularity and publishers found that there was a real market for them, the graphic novels started coming out for younger and younger age groups. And so now we're seeing a real spectrum of things that are for young readers, things that are for more tween readers, the between time, which we sort of think of as 11 to 14, as well as for teenagers and for adults. So there's really a wealth of graphic novels out there now.
I've actually not, seen much. So even though they're in my library here at the Colonie Town Library, I really haven't gone. And now you're going to pique my interest here and to take a look.
Oh, good.
So it's still, the graphic novels are obviously the benefits in terms of reading are that they actually have a discrete unit, a book like.
Right.
It's just looks just like a book, except that there are they're kind of cartoons.
Definitely cartoon-like style of illustration. And the books are usually, or nearly always, paperback. So more accessible, not so heavy to carry around, not so intimidating because of the hardcover. They're thinner. So they're very, very accessible.
And there's a storyline, and it moves from left to right like a regular, I guess but in my day, comic books were considered for the illiterate in a way, right?
There is that prejudice there, and we've had to let go of that, and I definitely would say to all parents, let go of that. It's not for the illiterate anymore. It's a different way of reading, and especially if you have what we would call a reluctant reader, a child who does not like to read, or a teen, this is a way in.
Would you talk a little bit about maybe some series or titles of books? I didn't ask you to prepare this, so maybe I'm catching you a little bit unprepared, but some titles of books or kinds of things that might be out there for teenage boys other than graphic novels. I mean, when I remember books like Hatchet by Gary Paulson.
Sure.
And I'm sure there are many more now. That was quite a while. That was 15 years ago at least. So are there other kinds of materials made for boys?
It's probably one way into that is to talk about the different sort of types of books. We talked about graphic novels, so that's one way. Another way, you bring up Hatchet, it's an adventure story. It's an outdoor survival story. Catching Spirit Bear by Ben Michelson would be another one, where it's a teenage boy against the elements, and of course always against himself, trying to find out what he's made of and how he can triumph over this antagonist in the story. So there's those kind of stories. Another thing that we can't forget is nonfiction. Boys are particularly nonfiction readers. They like facts. They like photos, from space of different planets. They maybe like photos of how things work if they're kind of more of an engineering mindset. So nonfiction is another good way to get a boy interested. And often with nonfiction books, you don't have to read it cover to cover. You can kind of jump around a little bit, and that's okay. That's reading as well. And boys as well as girls, but I think especially boys, like funny stories. So John Sheska for younger boys has the whole Knights of the Kitchen Table series. There's all kinds of very funny books. Don't be afraid to find those. And if you think it's really silly humor and your son should be reading something more serious, it's all right. You know, funny is good, and he's reading, and that's what boys like.
And I think that it is sometimes a prejudice on the parts of parents that they should be diverting their child's attention to much more serious or meaty kind of topics or something like that. And that's, in effect, I hear you saying, and I think I have heard before, that just about any reading is better than no reading.
It's true.
And to learn to have it be a place to escape, a place to learn, but to enjoy. And I know boys, younger boys, I understand, even though I've never had young boys, are less, they take a little bit more time to learn to settle down, to actually sit. So perhaps because girls are more willing to sit when they're young and curl up with a book, that teachers, parents give up on boys sitting quietly and reading. I always used to hear about treating books like like fragile things, and that's another prejudice.
It is.
And that's an advantage to having books at home, I think, is to let them have their books and their collection, and giving books as gifts is another part of that, is something that they can read over and over again. So that's book collection. I think book collecting is a terrific activity for kids too, as well. Is there anything else about the study? I don't know if we mentioned did you mention the title of the study? I don't know that I did.
It's called To Read or Not to Read: A Question of National Consequence.
Okay, and it was by the National Endowment
For the Arts.
For the Arts, and it was published in November of 2007.
Correct.
I'm sure it's available, or at least a summary is available on the web, and perhaps I'll be able to get it up on our screen when this program shows. Is there anything else that you would like to discuss about the study or about the implications for schools, libraries, parents?
Just to reiterate that one of the most important things that parents can do is to model reading. So even if you're not naturally what you would think of as a reader, there is something that you would enjoy looking at, whether it's a cookbook, whether it's a magazine about fashion, whether it's a popular mechanics where they talk about an engine, something. So find it, have it around the house, model. Bring your teenager and your children to the library. Have that be a regular part of your family life. And when you go together and you check out books, again, you're modeling, and you will start to develop an interest in reading in your child.
Right. Thank you very much
Welcome.
for being with us today, Mary Fellows from the Upper Hudson Library System. Thank you for being with us today, Parenting in the 21st Century.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.